Ibear MBA masterclasses. I'm Carl Voigt. I'm academic director of the program, and I want to welcome you from wherever you are in the world. We know we have our distinguished executive speakers joining us from Singapore and Hong Kong. But let me welcome you into this masterclass and get it going, because for you it's Saturday morning, for many of you it's late Friday evening, depending on where you are. So tonight our program will consist of our distinguished professor Arvind Bambri leading us through a discussion on strategic transitions, leadership and transitions, and as it relates to individuals' careers, discussing the success and how leaders take charge in situations. For those of you who have been in Arvind's class, you'll be here for another one of his amazing ways of taking complexity and making it simple. Not simplistic, but simple. Arvind is a renowned thinker of strategy on strategic change and management. He has received multiple awards for his teaching and education from his students. In fact, he has been singled out as one of the top 14 executive MBA teachers globally. But again, I'll go back to why I find it fun to sit and listen and learn from my colleague Arvind. Arvind has that iconoclastic, that rare ability to take a subject, to find dots in a subject that other people are looking at, and bring it together in a way that takes complexity, and as I said before, gives us a simpler, clearer, and a better understanding of that topic. Tonight, he's joined by two of our distinguished alums. He's joined by Paul Wilson, who comes to us tonight from Singapore. Paul has had here's an example of what Arvind wants to talk about, an executive who has made transitions leading from success to success. Currently, he is managing director of Google Cloud services in Singapore in the Asian region. Previous to that, he was at Amazon Web Services. Prior to that, he started his career in the U.S. Army in the Signal Corps. He is a healthy, I hope this is okay, Paul, healthy nerd quotient. He has a master's degree in computer science, and then has topped that off with an MBA from the USC School of Business. Thank you so much, Paul, for joining us. Somebody else who's joining us from Hong Kong is Farida Kasamboy. Farida is also somebody whose career has moved, and she's made numerous transitions. I would call her a seasoned executive, a seasoned marketing, advertising, brand strategist. She's moved from account services to brand strategy, from brand strategy to business strategy. Currently, she also has a bit of a nerd quotient, because she is a specialist in data strategy and digital transformation. And what also makes her more of a nerd is that she's put herself back in school, and she's pursuing a DBA at the City University of Hong Kong. So I want to welcome our distinguished speaker, my colleague, Professor Arvind Bambri, and Paul and Farida. A fun fact about Paul, he told me, is that he has a twin brother, and he's been confused in different countries, Japan, Korea, Singapore, for his brother. Farida had the nightmarish, I don't know what you want to call it. She had to sit through 2 of my classes. Having said that, she did exceptionally well. So tonight, again, we'll welcome you. We welcome all of you for joining us. Our plan tonight is to immediately turn this over to Arvind to lead us with some thoughts, and then we'll have a conversation between Arvind, Farida, and Paul. During this discussion, I invite you to type your questions into the chat function, because when we turn to Q&A, we will ask you to ask your question that you posted in the chat function. Importantly, for those that are interested, immediately after our masterclass, we will have an information session on MBA programs at USC Marshall, in particular, our 1-year intensive Ibear MBA program designed for experienced professionals. And with that, Professor Bambri, welcome, and thank you for being here tonight.
Thanks, Carl. It's always a pleasure to do something with the Ibear program. So can all of you see my slides? I just want to get a thumbs up. Perfect. Okay. So this is a picture of a Boeing 747 jumbo plane. Okay. And the first airline to fly the jumbo jet was Pan Am. And the first flight was in January 1970. About 51 years ago. And the interesting thing is that even as of this year, there are some Boeing 747s that are still on order, still being delivered. Okay. So this is a product that's had a more than a 50-year life cycle. So why is this interesting? Because it has significant implications for the kind of organization that you create, the kind of leadership skills that you need, the kind of culture and the values that you have in an organization when you're dealing with a 50 to 60-year product life cycle. Okay. And this is not atypical of the kinds of companies that dominated the most valuable companies in the world. If you go back 25, 30 years, that's when, you had companies like GE and Exxon and others that were among the most valuable companies. So when you think about the kind of culture that companies needed, when you're dealing with the life cycle of 50 plus years, development cycle of 10 years and maybe $5 to $10 billion in development expenses, the most critical requirement for success is that you not make any mistakes. Okay. So organizations tended to have lots of checks and balances, lots of documentation, reviews, multiple reviews and approvals. And the career trajectories of most people were to spend 30 to 40 years in one company, going up a functional track, high degree of specialization. And as a result of that, what you had was the personal identity of an individual was based on the company that they worked for. Okay. So if someone was called an IBMer or a GMer, that meant something. You immediately could have a picture in your mind about what that person's values were, how they made decisions, how they socialized, who their friends were, which college they went to, and because conformity with the company way of doing things was a predictor of success. So people would join one of these companies, one of these grand established companies out of school, retire from these companies 30 years later, get onto the company's pension plan, and sort of live out the rest of the days very comfortably, very often in communities where there were other people from the same company, right? So conformity, stability, specialization, competence in understanding what a company required was the predictor of success. Now we look at what companies are like today. Right? Microsoft today is the most valuable company in the world. And when I say today, I mean literally today, as of like 5 hours ago. Okay. So this is a list of largest companies by market cap at the end of today. Microsoft took over from Apple. Yesterday, Apple would have been the most valuable company. They're kind of neck and neck because we're really talking about, a couple of $1 billion difference. And, what's a couple of $1 billion when you're talking about a $2.5 trillion market cap? But if you look at these companies, Microsoft, Apple, Google, Amazon, Tesla, Facebook, right, the exceptions, Saudi Aramco is the exception on this list. Berkshire Hathaway is an exception on the list. But all the other companies are young companies, very young companies. And when you look at a lot of the companies that are being launched today, right, they're companies that develop apps, they're companies that build social communities, they're companies that help you promote a product that you have. The number of music content, the number of records or songs that are online available today is more than 1,000 times greater than were available 20 years ago. Okay, So think of the amount of noise, the amount of presence that exists in today's industries, right? So what is it like in this kind of industry? Digital native brands, okay, in 2018, 5% of unicorns were digitally native brands. In 2019, 10% of unicorns were digitally native. In 2020, 15% of unicorns were digital native. So you can see what the growth rate. It's not just the growth rate that's, I mean, these are exponential growth rates, right? So these digitally native companies are literally transforming a lot of what we do, whether it's in healthcare, whether it's in automobiles, whether it's in, or not, let me not say automobiles, let me say transportation, right? Whether it is in entertainment, right? In all of these areas, digital technology is completely transforming what we do. And if we look at what are the real consequences, among the most critical consequences is that as we move from physical asset intensive to knowledge asset intensive and physical asset light organizations, it completely changes the nature of the workplace, the nature of careers, the nature of professional identity. Okay. And that is what's really interesting from the context of what we're going to talk about today. Okay. Okay. For some reason, my slides were moving just fine. And now, okay. So what does this really do? When you get into digitally native organizations, it greatly reduces entry barriers and it enables new entrants, lowers entry barriers, so new entrants come in. And every time a new entrant enters a space, what do they bring? First of all, they bring more capacity, more ways of serving the customer's needs. So intensity of competition keeps rising. But in addition to that, what they also do is that they bring new ideas, new ways of competing. Now, we started with a picture that highlighted a company with a product life cycle of 54 years. Okay. And now we are in an era where sometimes product life cycles can be 8 months or 12 months. So in Boeing, you could spend your entire career in the company and live with the same product generation that had been introduced when you had joined, when you were a fresher. Now what happens is when you're with a company for 3 years, you may have gone through 4 product generations. So what happens when you're going through multiple generations at that speed is that your ability to add value in the context where you are starts to go down. So you look for new opportunities, you look for reskilling, you develop new competencies. But the bottom line of it is that you are constantly looking for moving from one opportunity to another. Okay? So the frequency of turnover at all levels in the organization go up. The other interesting factor is that when you are working in a company like this, where there are multiple products being launched, multiple apps being launched, is that your identity is not so much associated with the company as a whole as it is with a program, an idea, an app, something that you created. So a company might go out of business, as many startups, many high-tech startups, many digital startups do, but you can still leave with your reputation impact and in fact even being enhanced. You become known as the person who developed that wonderful app that, that within a week had attracted 50,000 users. So your personal contribution and impact become more important as part of your professional identity than the company as a whole that you work with. Now, but what is A second very important aspect, which is really the main focus of what we want to talk about today, is that employee turnover, career switches, career transitions goes up significantly at the level of the CEO, at the level of product managers, at the level of technology developers, software developers. In the earlier era, no one would leave a Boeing to join an Airbus because Airbus was the arch enemy. No one would leave Coca-Cola to join Pepsi. They might leave Coca-Cola and go join another consumer packaged goods company. But in this era where what you carry with you is your knowledge, your competencies, your networks, people switch between Google and Apple and Tesla and Facebook, and it's okay. Because what you did back at Google before you moved to Facebook has already been replaced by something else. Okay, so when you have that kind of rate of turnover, rate of obsolescence, rate of knowledge replacement, right? People are always looking to build a career based on what they are, how they are best using their technology, how much they are learning at a particular point in time. So a lot of what you do is about how you manage your own energy and how you orchestrate the energy of the other people around you. Okay. Now, in that context, let me now come to a framework that a colleague and I worked on many years ago on new executive transitions. And the main point that we wanted to study was, why is it that some executives are consistently more effective than others at entering new situations and becoming effective leaders, achieving transformational impact, and then going on to another situation and do it again and again. While in many cases, executives who were hired, in spite of wonderful backgrounds and track records, failed to have positive impact. Okay. And as we studied these, and a presentation that we gave on our research here at a Strategic Management Society won the McKinsey Award for Best Paper at that conference. What we spoke about were a few mistakes that people make. And I'm just going to touch on a couple of these here because it's sort of a longish discussion otherwise. That very often, especially the more senior an executive is, when they go into a new role, they come in with the thinking that their team wants to hear about their vision and their strategy for the long term. And that is a mistake. Instead, when you go in, regardless of what kind of image and reputation you bring with you, your initial challenge is, how do you build your credibility? There's a lot of uncertainty about how you will interact with your team. Your team has a high degree of uncertainty and a lot of unanswered questions. And so your initial challenge is always, how do I pick some issues around which I can have immediate results, immediate impact, and work as what we called a short-term results-oriented manager. Pick up on some issues that are tangible, that people are already concerned about, issues behind which you feel that you have a high probability of success, and that align with the model of leadership behavior that you want your team to internalize. Okay. You don't make your people a team by telling them you want to be a team. You make them a team by working as a team. And the best way to do that is to pick an issue that is of high concern and working on it, modeling the behavior that you want your team to replicate by observing you over time. Okay. How long you spend in this role depends on, are you an insider? Are you an outsider? What is the rate of change in your industry? Is your company going through a stage of crisis? Are they doing reasonably well? What's the rate of change in the industry? Are you behind your competitors? Are you ahead of your competitors? But even if you're doing well, you still have to go through this phase. And you know this phase is over when you see an emotional transition happen between how your team reacts to you and what kinds of problems they come to you with. You reach a stage where it becomes obvious emotionally that your team has reached the conclusion that they are better off with you as their boss than they were before you came in. It's at that stage that you can become more of a strategist and a visionary. Now, as part of our research, we had 7 or 8 different phases, depending on the stage where we were in our research. And at each stage, we developed certain nuances of what kind of leadership style is effective, what are the indicators of performance, what are the metrics that you should focus on, what's your role as the CEO or the leader, what's the role of your different team members, and so on. And I'm not going to go into all of those levels right now, but the key point here is that there is a sequence. And what's important in this is, one of the important things is that you have to be aware of your personal blind spots when you go into a new role, into a new organization. Because as you become successful, you also develop your own style of doing things. And as a result, you go into a new situation and you have a tendency to use an approach that worked for you in the past. Okay? And that becomes your personal bias. And that sometimes leads to what we call deceived success. Okay? Deceived success is when you think you're doing well, your team responds to you with positive feedback, but in fact, it's simply a camouflage because they haven't yet started to be open and honest with you. Okay? And that happens when you bring too many of your personal biases into a new role. So being aware of your personal biases, and most importantly, of sharing them and asking your team to point out when your biases are clouding your opinions, creates and sets a tone in the organization of openness and transparency that is really important when you're in a rapidly changing environment. Okay. So I'm going to start to wrap this up with a couple of simple things. Competence is really important, but competence are table stakes. Okay? If you're not competent, you shouldn't be a leader. Okay? But being competent is not enough. Okay? Competence means that you understand your technology, you understand the function, you understand your industry. But increasingly, to generate results along with competence, you also need a network, right? Because companies, as they become more and more focused in their business model, as they become more and more focused in certain parts of the value chain, they have to rely on partners and relationships. Very often you'll find that you have to meet a deadline that you cannot meet entirely by yourself. You have to reach out to your network. So having a network is really important. Okay? How do you build a network? By having a reputation for reciprocity, so that other people in your network know that they can count on you as well. But unless you are constantly renewing your competence and staying at the leading edge, your worth in your network starts to decline over time. So the third critical requirement for success in an environment where constant transitions are the norm, is to renew and learn continuously. Now, it's a very interesting, if you look in Silicon Valley and you look at people who are successful, they'll have a very interesting path. They join a company, maybe they're a product manager, they bring a product to market within 8 or 9 months, the product is really successful. So in 3 years, they've received huge bonuses, and then they leave the company and they go join a venture capital firm, right? Maybe they become a partner, but then within a year or two, they leave again. And this time they join a company that had pitched to the venture capital firm, right? And so you've got to know them. So one of the ways in which you maximize your renewal and learning is to be part of networks where a lot of current knowledge about businesses, about ideas, about concepts, about models is flowing. So you want to become part of the knowledge flow in the areas that you're interested in. And that in turn gives you new opportunities. And over time, what happens is you build a personal brand. You become a personal brand so that when you are you want to attract people to work with you, right? They come to you because, oh, I'd love to work with Paul. I'd love to work with Farida, right? Because you've already developed that recognition. And interestingly, all of these elements feed on each other, because once you develop a personal brand, you get opportunities to be engaged in new projects, new ideas, new partnerships that enhances your competence, which in turn broadens your network, which expands your renewal and learning and further contributes to your brand, right? And it's being able to manage this kind of circular positive loop that you need to be successful as a business leader in an environment of constant renewal and change. Okay. Now, the two people that we have here today, Paul Wilson and Farida Kasumbai, both of them are people who have demonstrated in practice the synergistic effect of competence, network, renewal, learning, and personal brand. Okay, and I'm going to start with Farida for a few minutes and then with Paul, and both of them I'm going to ask to answer the same questions. And there are 3 related questions. I'm going to tell you all of them, but I'd like you to start with the first one first. As both of you have gone through significant professional transitions in your life, right? Of different sizes of companies. There have been some common strands in the transitions in that both of you have mostly been involved with technology. So I'd like you to look back on your key professional transition and comment on which were, in your mind, the most significant and the most challenging professional transition to make. Okay. Then what I'd like you to do is then to talk about, as you look back on your professional transitions, what have you learned about being successful in an environment where transitions are the norm? Okay. So let's just start with those 2 questions. And then I'll follow up with another question as well. Okay, so Farida, can you start, please, and start with, look back on the professional transitions, of which you've had several. And right now, Farida is the Group Chief Digital Officer of a company that's based in Hong Kong, of Pico Holdings. And, it's in an industry that, a couple of decades ago would not even have existed. And Farida, maybe it would be helpful if you actually take a minute to describe what it is that your company does, and then talk about what are all the transitions that brought you to this position of Group Chief Digital Officer.
Okay, thank you, Professor Arvin. Hello, everyone. Yes, so currently I'm the CDO.
Farida, before Arvin, would you cancel your slides so Farida and Paul can take the screen? There we go. Thank you. Sorry, Farida, back to you.
No problem. Yes, so currently I'm the CDO of Pico, and Pico is a global brand activation event management company. It's actually more than 50 years ago now. So they were listed in Hong Kong 25 years ago, originally a Singapore company. So basically it is event agency that runs major events like World Expo that is happening now in Dubai, a lot of auto shows and event and exhibitions. So you can imagine last year was really a very tough time for our company. To go back to this topic that Professor Alvin mentioned, why did I come up with become this CDO position? I was actually headhunted 3.5 years ago, actually right after I finished my Gamba 2018. I received this invitation to join this company. At that time, it was very hot to talk about digital transformation. But so basically my career started more than 27 years ago now. I only worked for 5 companies altogether. So the first 3 companies I was with WPP Group. So over 17 years, I worked for JWT, Ogilvy and Bates, starting in Melbourne. So as you can imagine, working as an advertising executive at the time, I was just very focused. And I guess I was lucky to work on a major brand at the time called Ford Motor Company. So when I started off in Melbourne, I basically worked very well in terms of the entire portfolio of the brands. I learned the automotive industry. So in total, after 5 years working in Melbourne, they actually seconded me to Beijing in China. So I was the first mover in China to conduct advertising, professional advertising business in there. And then it was quite funny to look at what Professor just mentioned about the positive or the circular models. I actually did not realize, but now that he explained, I think I was hit on all those circles. I think most importantly is after working in the industry for a while, you picked up some young people as well. So I think after, when I departed Ogilvy, I joined another agency. I was becoming the head of strategy already, and I picked up a few young people. So currently, my current team that I have basically moved from companies to companies together with me for more than 15 years now. So every time when I move to another company, I would have a core team of 3 to 4 people who follow me, no matter where they are. And I think that is something very important, especially if you say, when you go to a new company, you want to conduct something, you yourself alone may be very open to attack. So if you want to have immediate results, you need to have some right hand or left hand people to help you to implement or explain. So then after the WPP opportunity, I was actually again approached by the Chinese most independent and largest online media agency called Highling Digital. I was there with them for 7 years. When I first started, their turnover was 1.5 billion RMB. And after 7 years, we were actually listed and we were more than 10 billion. So they transitioned from a media buying agency to a full-fledged integrated digital marketing companies. And I was lucky at the time that I was their CSO. And then apart from handling providing the capacity building, I was actually created this data technology center. And I was heavily involved in designing and creating ad tech products like the DMP and the programmatic buy. And I used to work with a lot of creatives and account service or clients. But at the tail end of my Highling pursuit, I was actually day to day, I run 80 people research and development center who are all engineers and programmers. So and then that led me to my current position. My chairman is asking me to help him to transit this traditional event management agency into a more digitally equipped company. So that's what I'm currently doing as a CDO. And I guess, COVID is actually helping me a lot to change the mindset of people, and whatever I've been talking about 3 years ago, I'm talking about the same thing, but it's kind of like all of a sudden after COVID, they sort of understand what I'm trying to say. So that is quite a funny experience. Arvin? Are you on mute?
Thank you. Now, Paul, you worked with an interesting collection. So when people talk about Amazon, you work with Amazon. People talk about Microsoft, you work with Microsoft, you work with Google, and now you're managing director in Singapore for Google for the public sector cloud services, which is an important growth initiative for them. So, how do you sort of maneuver your career transitioning from one position to another?
So Arvin, thank you, and good evening, good morning, everybody. I was interested when you were talking about the IBMers. My father was a 33-year career veteran at IBM, so many of the points you made in terms of culture, in terms of the identification of the persona, it was spot on. My career really, I think, reflects the change of technology over many years. As Carl had mentioned, I began my career as a communications officer. I took those skills, those communication skills, telecommunication skills, into the corporate world after I transitioned at the University of Southern California at the Ibear program. And after some period of time in working in telecommunications, from providing equipment and services to then supporting new mobile operators with consulting and advisory services, I transitioned to software and applications, and then more recently into the cloud industry, the cloud computing industry, which of course includes dynamics such as artificial intelligence, machine learning, security, and so on. And so as I look back at some inflection points, and as you question what were some of the most challenging experiences that I had during different parts of that transition, Arvin, I think it really to stress that it's the competence, and it's not a guaranteed. If you have, particularly in the technology industry, you need to constantly be learning and relearning and renewing, as you say, in terms of the technology, maybe not to the degree of depth that you would when you're starting out earlier in your career. You're a little bit more at a higher layer of abstraction in terms of appreciating the technology for pure technology's sake, but understanding the impact of technology on customers and maybe even larger trends to the world at large. One of the more interesting transitions I had to make was after having spent 5 years, so to back up a little bit, I was at Microsoft for a number of years here in Asia, supporting education, healthcare, government through this transition and how to use effectively software and so on. Even within that industry, which looks a bit dated now, but there was tremendous change in business model. Many of us remember when we purchased software, as an example, as a one-time transaction, a perpetual license. That software industry evolved to having a subscription model wherein you effectively purchase the right to use software for a period of time, typically annually, but often multi-year agreements. That required software organizations to change. So the industry was changing, but the companies themselves had to change because of their business model. They needed to create teams and specialists who would be more engaged with customers, to do renewals, to drive that consumption. The partner landscape for these companies also needed to change quite dramatically, wherein they were typically competing on reseller margins of a software license. Now it was all about value-added services and support, and that was the differentiator. So even within industry, the change that an organization creates an opportunity, but it does require you to continue to renew and to learn. I had worked in that industry, in the software industry, for a number of years. There was a period of time where I felt, actually, to your point, Arvin, that there were some competencies that I really wasn't gaining and I couldn't really find in that organization. And I decided to leave the organization, become an entrepreneur. I spent the next 5 years in Myanmar, in Southeast Asia, and had a wonderful experience. But the competencies that I felt that I was missing really was to be more impactful to society. You can do that within a company, but the timing was right for me to work with some individuals. I ended up becoming a partner for Microsoft, but importantly, at the request of the US government and US Agency for International Development, I created an advisory council for the Myanmar government at that time with global technology companies through issues such as intellectual property, security, and so on, and economic development. It was that transition back into essentially a new world of cloud computing that was a real challenge, because I had spent 5 years developing this competency in areas that were very important to me in my career, but I was out of sync with the technology. So it definitely required a period of relearning, of renewal. To your other point about having this network, I was able to draw on the networks and the relationships that I had maintained and had created over many years in Asia to land effectively at Amazon Web Services. So it was a very interesting transition, but it required me to dig very, very deeply to take on the additional learning, self-learning, to get back in sync, if you will, with the technology. Your other question around kind of looking back and what have I learned, were transitions being the norm. Absolutely correct. It's your network and this sense of curiosity that if you don't have a genuine, deep sense of curiosity about your industry or about companies and even society, it's very, very difficult to just kind of become passé and therefore become less valuable. So to build on your themes of having the competence, it's incredibly important to not take that for granted, particularly in the technology industry where the pace of change is very rapid. Having this network is incredibly important for yourself as you re-enter, in my experience, re-entering from a frontier market back into kind of a more mature business market, but also really having this deep desire and curiosity about what works. And if you're successful, why are you successful? And frankly, it was really my transition from the military to the corporate world, that important transition point of the Ibear MBA program, I think, for me, deeply instilled this sense of curiosity about different cultures, about how to think about things. But those are some of the things that I've learned in terms of my period in the tech industry here in Asia. Back to you, Arvin.
So that's very interesting, because what both you and Farida touch on in different ways is learning, continuous learning. And having been in academics almost all my life, although I've spent a lot of time with companies along the way, is that learning has a prerequisite, and the prerequisite is curiosity, because it's your personal curiosity that drives your desire to learn. The second dimension that seems to be really important in effective leadership in today's environment is to combine that curiosity with humility, because you can only learn if you accept the fact that there are things that you don't know. And you often learn, especially in technology-based industries, from the younger people that you are surrounded with, because they are literally on the cutting edge of things. A couple of companies that I've worked with, they have a very interesting exercise. When they do their annual strategy sessions, the first day of their 3-day strategy retreat, they invite people who are below the age of 25 in the company to come in and talk about what they see as the most interesting things happening in technology, right? And for them, it's like mind-blowing experience, because those are things that for them, it's like, that's just not the way they think. So being open, doing things like that. So how do both of you manage the balance between sticking with something and changing, right? Because in academics, we talk about something called ambidexterity, namely that you need to stick with things long enough to extract value, but you need to change before you are forced to change. And so how do you make that balance, both in terms of your personal decisions as well as the teams that you're leading?
To me, personal, I think I never stop learning. So like Carl said, currently I'm studying my doctorate degree in Hong Kong. But even before that, after Gamba, I've been doing quite a lot of online executive education, like from INSEAD. I just learned, how to do AI. And then with Yale on decision making as well. But in terms of how I do change or conduct change management in my current company per se, I think it is quite important example to share, because you imagine if there's no digital disruption, no COVID or whatever, my current company has been doing quite well in terms of the way they manage their business. The process is very, kind of within that industry, they already master it. And then a lot of old people or very loyal people have been working in there, so they don't see any need for change. And especially if I don't come from an event industry, then they will say, well, what do you know? We don't need digital, that kind of thing. And then I think it's quite important that I got full support from my chairman, but at the same time, in order to prove to those people, if we want to make some change, I think we need to identify some areas that is not too hurting, and we need to start small and then use a pilot to engage some people who are willing to change first, and then prove and then build up on the technology stack. And that's how I did it with my current company. Yeah.
That's a good response, Frida, because one of the questions that we have in the chat box is, how do you measure that you are doing it right? When you're constantly changing and implementing new ideas, by definition, you're doing some things where you don't have all the answers. There is uncertainty. And what you're saying is that, you do it in a prudent way. You start small, you learn quickly, you do projects, you do test balloons. And then once you've validated your hypotheses, then you expand, right? Okay, Paul?
So I think there's a couple of things that are really fascinating about the technology industry, and particularly having worked for three of the larger companies in this industry. One of the things that I've learned is that the generation of workers coming into the companies now, they're very different, and not only in terms of kind of appreciating technology and just how they interface with technology, very different from me and my experience at that age, but frankly, just what motivates them. So Arvind, to your point about having humility, incredibly important to communicate a degree of confidence in terms of you have a clarity of vision. There's a sense of where you want to take the organization, but at the same time also having a sense of agility and openness. Mm-hmm. And I think companies can certainly have to be responsive. You have to understand kind of where trends are going, and you have to make the right investments. If you miss a cycle, as you mentioned, if you miss a cycle, you could be disrupted very quickly. But also, I think for individuals themselves, there is creating this degree of openness and being very genuine, humility. That's an incredibly important component of leadership. Maybe less so than it was. And I'm an ex-military person. So kind of what does humility mean to an ex-military person versus somebody who didn't have that background? Mm-hmm. So coming back to my curiosity about what motivates people, The other thing I would say that's very important is to what does success look like in the medium term?
Right. Yeah.
And what is it customers will always tell you at the end of the day whether you're successful or not, but how do you then unpack that success if it's a sustainable success? But the nature of people joining the workforce and that just breadth of talent, and it's so inspiring when you get people who have the general framework, the guardrails, if you will, of where you want to go. As leaders, it's much less about directing than it is about guiding at this point.
Yeah.
And if you can tap into that passion, that energy, particularly as younger people have, you will see the results as a leader.
Yeah. And just establishing some guardrails so that they can't go too far off the ranch. Yeah. Now, one of the first questions in the chat is very detailed and a very interesting question that's been put up. And the question is, he said that my initial introduction seemed to imply that short product life cycles and development cycles inevitably lead to high attrition. And isn't it, on the other hand, a better interpretation might be that high attrition is the result of a lack of long-term vision and leadership. That, just if you're in a rapidly changing technology industry doesn't mean you have to have high attrition necessarily. So I have a comment on that as well, but how would you respond to it?
So I can take the first shot. It's a great point. And if you look at my career, I did move around a bit in terms of technology, but you also have to remember that there are entirely new industries being created in the technology space. So artificial intelligence, or more recently, security, cybersecurity.
Yeah.
4 quarters ago, if you looked at the number of unicorns that were in the AI space, the artificial intelligence space versus the cybersecurity space, and you look at it today, they'd be completely inverted.
Yeah.
And so I think as individuals, there are, particularly in the tech field, there are more opportunities, but that does put more of an onus on companies like the ones that I've worked for to create this sense of learning, adaptability, and opportunity for individuals.
Yeah. Okay, Farida?
Well, I think in my case or my industry, we are not creating something as big as a Facebook community or a Google, but all we do is provide some user application that can help improve the process and also enhance the efficiency of doing things. So I think whatever the tailor-made products that we provide or create for the company or even for the clients, we have this mentality that fail fast. You don't have to be afraid of failing. Nobody say you can create one thing and then become an instant success. But I think most importantly is when you know this is not successful, you have to understand why, and then you consolidate the learning and then continue with the long-term vision and build. And that is the real example.
Yeah. Excellent points from both of you. I think the point that I would make on high attrition being inevitable is that it isn't inevitable. On average, the attrition is higher in technology spaces than in non-technology spaces. But in part, it's because a lot of opportunities are getting created. It's because rapid product life cycles, short life cycle development cycles, they facilitate changes, professional changes, because teams are constantly being formed, reformed. The product you're working on today is very different from what you were working on, let's say, 3 years ago. So you don't feel that you are deeply entrenched in something. So you do have a more flexible perspective on what you're working on. And so very often the choice is not, should I leave this company or not? It's, I'm going to be working on something different. Should I be doing that in the company where I already am, or should I look at an opportunity elsewhere? Because change becomes the norm when you are in a short product development cycle industry. And if you're changing anyway, you sort of often tend to have a wider perspective on trying to decide what it is that you want to do. Now, last question, because I think we're going to be ending soon. Okay. Let me make this a question from the audience. When you're switching companies at fairly frequent intervals, is it more difficult or easier to move up the hierarchy ladder?
The question that's it's always kind of, you ask yourself as you look in hindsight. But in my case, for my current role, the organization didn't exist. Google Cloud has been around for a while, but the public sector, a dedicated team, January 2020 is when globally that was stood up. I was hired to create an entirely new team. Now we went from essentially a few employees. We have well over 100. We'll grow even more. So in that instance, if there's an opportunity, and to Arvin's point earlier about this networking, you can leave and you have this network and people will ask you based on the competencies and the credibility that you've created earlier in your career and the relationships and so on, that does there and provide that opportunity. So for me, I've been fortunate, but I have colleagues who have stayed with one company for 20 years and they've done incredibly well. So it really just, it depends, but it's really following that passion.
Yeah. Okay. All right,
okay.
Frida.
For my case, I actually don't think about moving up the ladder when I was in that moment. I think it's very important that you focus on what you are tasked to do. So even if you change your job and you go to different organization, you have a bigger title, doesn't mean your responsibility is more. But if you can prove yourself in the current company that maybe you'll never change the title, but your jurisdiction and authority is getting more. So I don't think that is important to think about for now. Yeah.
In fact, coming back to humility, I think it's useful always to keep in mind, and I advise many of my students when they're taking on roles and so on and moving into a new position, maybe getting a promotion, is tell them to remember that they may have a bigger title, but they're still the same person they were the day before, right? They don't know anything more. So when you get a promotion, your humility should increase because you should be saying, look, my title's gone up, my salary's gone up, and I'm responsible for so many more people and such a bigger chunk of the budget, but I don't know anything more than I did before. So how do I now get my people to work with me, collaborate with me, help me, and so on? That it's interesting, but having listened to all of this, I think where I come out is it's an exciting time to be studying business, to be entering business. It's like, it has so many more dimensions than existed 30 years ago in business. And this variety, this diversity, this rate of change is a wonderful time to come to a business school and not just get a degree, but learn how to learn quickly about business, about new business dimensions, and become part of a network, an extended network that comes together the way you're constantly learning from them. Okay, any last comments from either one of you? And then I think it's right at 7 o'clock. I will hand it over to Carl and Pankaj. Okay. I have to say it's really good to see both of you here and to do this session with you.
So
thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Arvind.
Let me thank Arvind, my colleague, and our guru for leading us through some interesting thoughts, and for Rita and Paul to flesh out these ideas in such a wonderful and refreshing way. It's always great to leave with more questions in the question group. We will have future master classes, and we are looking forward to you joining us for them. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Dean Drobnik.
Thank you, Carl, and thank you, Arvind and Paul and Farida. I mean, one of the things this masterclass demonstrates, in addition to the quality of Arvind as a great teacher and researcher, is the depth and connection of the Marshall School of Business with its graduates, with Paul and with Farida, that we can call on them and ask them to donate their time and their interest, but also to have them come to campus and speak and be mentors for students. And that's one of the strengths of the business school and the strengths of our faculty, that we become not just mentors or teachers to our students, but really become lifelong friends. And that's really quite, it's true with all American schools to some extent, but it's really true with the Ibear MBA program because of the intensity of it, the 12-month intensity and the mid-career nature of it. So I hope that many of you who are on this masterclass will stay for the next 30 or 45 minutes to have an information session about the upcoming Ibear MBA program and have a chance to speak with two of the recent alumni from Ibear 38 and Hiroshi Fuji from ANA and from Ibear 42, Sam Liu. And once again, Arvind, Paul, Farida, thank you very much. Pankaj, I'll turn it over to you for the information session.
Thank you, Drake. Thank you, Arvind and Paul.